Welcome back. Winter is upon us, and although it may not look like it, we're in a little bit of a precarious situation here. An unexpected balloon of surprisingly decent pawns early on has kicked my colony population higher than I'd like for this stage of the game, and while I've explained at length about the problems that causes with raid strength and combat capacity, I haven't touched on one of the obvious ones just yet. Pants. Specifically, the lack of them. Even more specifically, that many of my pawns have items of clothing that are rotting off their bodies and are running about with their bits out in the middle of winter. Unsurprisingly, this tends to make them, testy. For now, I opt to get them kitted up in blue fur tribal wear and some cloth toques, because that's really all I have. The tribal wear in particular may make them look like a Neanderthal in a hospital gown, but it actually outperforms most other skin layer clothing types when it comes to thermal regulation. It covers the whole body, and it's cheap, so it's actually pretty decent as long as you ignore the potential for questing breezes when the wind kicks up. Now we get to work on feeding the endless void that is these people's stomachs, which is probably something I should start worrying about sooner rather than later. Sunlamp farming is right around the corner, and if I really need to, I can switch over to nutrient paste until then, but for now I opt to solve this minor inconvenience by applying high-efficiency population management practices on any bit of local wildlife larger than a pig, and that should tide us over for a while. Of course, the one drawback of that strategy is that sometimes the animals pull the reverse card, so this does result in several of my pawns having the living daylights beaten out of them by angry caribou. That's fine, they'll walk it off. Or crawl, as the case may be. While all of those slightly incapacitating injuries work themselves off, I tell my mining team to get to work excavating a thinly roofed area I found in my mountain. Ideally speaking, we wouldn't want any of these at all, since they represent a weak point that mortar fire and drop pods can land in, but if they're properly managed, these spots can be excellent staging points for mortar batteries, drop pod zones, and recreational areas, and I want to know what I'm working with before I plan too much out. While that's going on, I get another mech cluster dropping in. This is an example of one of those clusters that is actually nice to have, thankfully. The sieging equipment here is a weather controller, set to make the area foggy, and other than reducing ranged weapon accuracy and preventing other weather types from taking effect, fog is harmless, and the mechs won't leave until the area is damaged or destroyed. Despite this, the cluster will still attract hostile raider attention if I wake it up, and keep all my pawns inside walled areas, so it's basically just a win one human raid-free card with some hefty space requirements. For better or worse, the thinly roofed seam proves to be quite expansive, but is still encompassed by a thickly roofed mountain on all sides. I'm not entirely sure what I want to do with most of the space just yet, but I suspect as I progress further into Save Our Ship and need to start launching and maintaining shuttlecraft, that particular space will become a fair bit more valuable. For now, I content myself with backfilling it with cheap wooden walls to prevent drop pods from getting the wrong idea, and carving out a space for my new rec room. Pawns without the undergrounder trait, which is all of them currently, don't tend to enjoy living in caves, and the best way I've found to mitigate the claustrophobia that develops is to make sure their dining and recreation areas are technically outside in an unroofed but still defended area. This guarantees them at least an hour or two of sunlight a day, which is usually enough to hold off the worst of the crazies. In Royalty, recreation areas also serve as a requirement that has to be satisfied when hosting nobles, but other than adding some thematic set-piece furniture, those requirements are largely a one-to-one match for what you would want to do with a combined recreation and dining room anyway, so there's nothing too special to worry about there. During that project, the god of kind of pathetic mechanoid encampments drops another one on me, this time with a defoliation machine that normally would be problematic but is too far away to actually affect anything I care about, so I can safely use it as raider bait once the first one gets too trashed to be useful. Right after that, I'm then offered a quest to host refugees. It's a new quest type, and it is exactly what it says on the tin. You get free temporary colonists. You feed them, they work for you. Sometimes they'll try to betray you, sometimes not. Truly, it is the chocolate box of the Rimworld questline. Now, a good, kind, benevolent host would treat them like they're members of your colony, with the same rights and privileges that implies. I am basically the diametric opposite of that, because as far as I'm concerned, this quest is a colonist loot box, and the minimum reward is a few hours of cheap labor before said reward starts rioting because they don't get free handouts and gold-plated toilet seats. If you want to be treated well and recruited, you need to bring your A game, and I'm sorry to say that pessimism and tortured artistry just aren't doing it for me. It is immediately obvious why these four were wandering around without a faction, and after 2 murderous rages and a targeted tantrum attempting to destroy my advanced components before the effects of my mistreatment kick in, I decide to throw in the towel. Remaining guy, you get to go punch the mech cluster to wake it up. Have fun. Everyone else, you get to go skinny dipping in the snow until you have a dirt nap, or get bored and leave, whichever comes first. I don't really care. I signed on to host contributing members of society, not walking liabilities with nutritional requirements. Yeah, speaking of mech clusters, I forgot to mention one important little detail. They like to go after friendlies. Some people may see this as a downside. I see it as actually quite positive, because it gives me free stuff without affecting my faction relations. It's not my fault they bungled their way into a mech cluster, after all. Besides, it's not like other factions can run out of pawns, so it's less like a war crime, and more like I'm outsourcing my defense contracts to a third party made entirely out of civilian conscripts. Speaking of said civilian conscripts, I'm out of food again, and wouldn't you know it, but I see a whole lot of the stuff on the hoof just wandered in outside. It's not exactly beef, but it sure is what's for dinner. Yeah, I kinda need to get farms going again. The conga line of dead muffalos may do the job, but it is getting a bit silly. Having had a chance to see it in use, I suspect that I developed the use mech buildings as static defenses strategy on an ice sheet map, because they really do not play nice with trade caravans, and I feel like I would have remembered that if it was as much of an issue as it has been recently. Thus far, the mechs have taken out 2 caravans and an entire cohort of civilians, and 0 raiders. And all I got to show for it was a trashed mech cluster and a bunch of dead friendlies. I may have to rethink this strategy moving forwards. Free pawns? Oh boy, I love expendable labor. The refugees are, per usual, utterly terrible, and unlike last time, I have no food to feed them. But seeing those pawns next to those tasty animals does raise an interesting question. I wonder how many defenseless meals on wheels I can beat to death with these 3 before they give up and collapse. Let's find out. 1, 2... So with the help of Shorty's raging go-juice dependency, it turns out the answer is a lot. The number goes up even higher if you add on the 2 links that he aggroed and drove into the mech cluster before collapsing, so it's actually a little bit more than that, but that's still really impressive for 3 unskilled melee users. I hope you enjoyed your vacation. See, there you go. That is what mech balls are supposed to do. It does highlight a weakness with the strategy, though, in that once any non-wall, non-barricade component of the structure is damaged below 50%, all of the mechs will lose their tether and start roaming, which usually results in them starting to punch down the walls of your base. It isn't a problem here because all the mechs was a single half-dead centipede, but later on those giant mech balls can be colony enders if you aren't expecting them. Now that I'm no longer limited by materials, it's time to get a proper base cooling system built up. I still haven't figured out a good automatic solution for temperature swings, but my initial design was never intended to cool an interior this large, and we've been courting insect attacks all summer as a result. That's an easy fix. The negentropic freezer design I've been using until now is an incredibly inefficient adaptation of the original, so all I need to do is shell out for a real one. Credit here to the Reddit user HarryDare6686, who, unfortunately for me, seems to have done their homework really darn well, because I've spent double-digit hours of my life trying to refine this design and haven't gotten anything even close. Incidentally, good job, Frostballs, you almost just lost a fistfight with an angry rat. Truly, this is an exemplary example of the extreme performance I've come to expect from my pawns, and you did not let me down. You took me out back and shoved me into an unmarked grave. Anyway, the key to supercharging the cooler technology, for those wondering, is recycling the cold air. Rimworld's coolers don't have a limit to how cold they can get, but they do have a maximum temperature differential they can maintain, which is generally enough to drop a single block space down about 100 degrees below the ambient temperature. If, instead of pumping that cold air into the environment, you circle it back around into the other side of the cooler, you can then get a feedback loop that quickly chills the entire differential chamber to within a few degrees of negative 273 Celsius, which is the minimum temperature allowed by the game engine. Since the strength of the cooler scales with the strength of the differential, this bumps its efficiency by multiple orders of magnitude, and you would get even higher returns if for some reason you were cooling an abnormally hot room. A fact that will be worth remembering here in a few episodes. So with my internal issues nice and repressed through the power of technological innovation, I can now turn attention to my outsides, which have thus far been criminally neglected to the point that I'm honestly not sure how I've gotten away with it for this long. Unintentional allegory to the modern mental health crisis. Neato. Anyway, I've been getting a ton of stuff that I can just feed to my pet mech outpost, but, like, really? I have a single block-thick wooden barricade with no other defenses built into it. How has this not gotten someone killed yet? It is long past sapper o'clock, so my fortifications first focus on working with an intentional weak point I engineered next to my ever-so-seductive underground apartment complex. Beds, plus thin walls, plus no turret coverage is a combination nearly irresistible to the Sapper AI, and I would honestly be shocked if they went anywhere else. It is, obviously, a trap, and once I'm done, that whole place will be riddled with defensive embrasures to obliterate anything that makes the terrible mistake of trying to French their way through Agincourt 2.0. During this time, Saya and ferrets start hooking up. Congratulations! I think. I haven't really mentioned it thus far, but there have been some seriously Rimworld-grade relationship dramas going on here, because my colony lucked into a gender and age distribution that is really conducive to forming relationships, but everyone is so terrible at flirting they keep rejecting each other and feeling sad about it. I would say it's like high school all over again, but that would be an insult to the emotional maturity of teenagers. So you remember when I was worried about how my base wasn't cold enough? Remember how I solved that problem? Yeah, I forgot a step, and that step was reconnecting the differential room of the old cooler to the rest of the cool spot. This 10-block room is the only area on the entire map with a thick rock roof over it that is less than negative 17 degrees centigrade. You only need one tile for an infestation. Oh boy, here we go. Wow, okay. Never mind then. I bumped the game difficulty from the default losing is fun value of 220% up to 300% after this, because that wasn't a raid, that was a mildly more hands-on version of one of those live seafood restaurants where they let you pick your own lobster and then cook it for you. The "don't go to this place, they make you punch elk to death" message apparently hasn't gotten out to people yet, so yet another group of hapless refugees has asked to shack up with me. I accept, since it's always worth trying to fish for good recruits, but like the two groups before, there isn't anyone worth recruiting, so now I'm stuck finding them something to do. Which ends up being pretty easy, as I tell them to, Zerg rush the raiders on a downed shuttle mission to try and soak fire. Defending these is nearly impossible at the current cave stage due to the terrible state of my pawns' training and equipment, but it's another relatively cheap opportunity to try and get some free recruits and gear, and I have temporary expendable assets, so I might as well use them. Nothing came of it other than a couple fire foam packs, which I will be reselling to the first trader that buys them, because the things are useless, but still worth a shot. If natural farming was going to be difficult before, the next event here makes it functionally impossible, as a second climate adjuster pops up nearby, this time operated by a bunch of pirates operating under the hilarious delusion that I care about the outside temperature in literally any capacity. I hope they brought a deck of cards or something, because we are firmly in the cold bothers you far more than it bothers me territory, and the colder it gets, the less I care, so like the first sight, I have no intention of taking this one out. I had kind of hoped to have a run that wasn't situated in a frozen wasteland, but whatever works, I guess. Soon after, the impossible happens. I finally got a pawn from the refugee quests that I actually want. Esmo here is a tough, masochistic ascetic who absolutely loves crafting, and I absolutely want to add him to the colony. Naturally, this means that his group of refugees spawned in right next to the mech cluster that somehow has still not gotten wiped out by Randy raids, putting him in a, generously undesirable tactical position. The fog here helps out a lot by blunting the initial mech volley, and I was able to get our MVP behind the fog generator and out of sight. But that doesn't really help because I'm not going to risk approaching with my pawns, and making a smoke launcher to block target acquisition would just take too long. I tried having his buddies blow up a turret and cause a chain reaction, but the sluggers took them out, so in the end I just had to bait the volley fire and have him take a runner into cover provided by a random meteor impact. Amazingly, this worked, so I booked over someone to arrest him as soon as he got out of range. Refugees tend to get angry and leave if you do things like use them as cannon fodder, and I'm not about to take a chance of losing this one through something so stupid as caring about the gross mistreatment of your traveling companions. The sudden 20-degree temperature dip facilitated by a bunch of climate change deniers with advanced terraforming equipment does do one thing. It encourages me to install a heater. Just one, though, no need to get crazy with it. Strictly speaking, there is no downside to having my base maintain an even colder temperature as long as nobody is freezing to death, so mostly this was just an excuse for me to experiment with thermal buffering effects. But if I ever need to quickly reheat the mountain for some reason, it will do the job quite handily. Brendan McMillan, which I had to shorten to just Brendan, joins up just in time to be sent to take out our faithful fog generator, which is all that remains after a group of unusually well-armed friendlies finally got around to destroying the turrets. Brendan here is an interesting pawn. Masochistic and tough scream frontline combat potential, and that trait combination in particular means he is uniquely suited to be a specific kind of stupidly overpowered combat sidecaster that is nearly impossible to build for otherwise. Sadly, his combat skills are sitting roughly around as dangerous as a bowl of wet grapes levels, so getting him usable is going to be a bit of a slog. But that is a fixable problem, and with a trait spread like that, it isn't like he's going to be lazing around in the meantime. It's that time again. This charming group of individuals was supposed to be a siege, but then an angry lynx went in for a bite, chomped off a bit more than it could chew, and someone losing a butt cheek aggroed the entire raid and sent them straight for me for some reason. This is a good thing, because I had just decided to try and take this one out when it happened. Convenient, that. Either way, this will be an excellent litmus test of my defense abilities. Here, swampy, swampy, swamp. Of course, for all of my wonderful fortification attempts, I have neglected to include a bait door, so the whole design kinda struggles a bit, but other than that, it comports itself excellently, and I divide and conquer the siegers turned zergers into successively smaller chunks without any issues, and only minimal injury. The next raid, however, goes a little bit worse, and ended up requiring a substantial amount of setup to clean out. While I get that going, let's talk Turkey. Gobble gobble. There are, for all intents and purposes, 4 relevant bits of the mech structure here we have to worry about. The first is the mechs themselves, which are a not unmanageable but still nasty combination of 2 centipedes with some other random chaff thrown in. The second and third bits are 2 beacons that will call in mech reinforcements from drop pods when the cluster activates. There's nothing I can do about this, it'll just happen. The fourth is something called a low shield. This is a one-way bullet shield, sort of, that will prevent my pawns from firing in while allowing any projectiles to fire out. And I say sort of because mech projectiles fly through it in both directions to prevent obvious cheese tactics. I don't technically have to attack this structure, but the threat module here is a mortar, and unlike the humanoid versions, mech mortars never get bored, sleep, eat, or have mental breaks, and it will quite happily keep hammering me until the end of time if I don't. If possible, there are also 2 bits of the cluster I want to save. The first is the shield emitter itself, because I can craft a temporary version out of its remains to use with my pawns later on, and the second is this mech node, which is basically a slightly weaker version of a vanometric power cell with anger management issues. The mortar is too well positioned to cleanly snipe, there are too many mechs to hold down a frontal assault, and bait and run tactics won't work here because I don't have a sniper rifle. They are, however, sleeping. And there aren't any prox detectors nearby, so it seems like a fortified sapping attempt is the only good option. The way sapping works, usually, is that I'll create a U-shaped bowl with the top end of the U pointing away from the main body of the mechs. When they're asleep, mechs will literally let you run past them without waking up, so you can get very close to the base when you do this. After that's done, wake the mechs up and poke them with your aggravation method of choice. I chose a door and a rifle bullet, but anything will do. This aggroes the mechs and they will path to the nearest hostile entity, which will be the colonists in your sapping fort. Boom. You have now turned a mech pod into a bog-standard colony defense battle, albeit with lousier walls, and you can now EMP, shoot, and stab them to your heart's content, while ignoring the rest of the base. When I was done cleaning up, I opted to carefully dismantle the rest of the structures and was able to recover both high-value structures after building some walls to eat the explosion from their collapsing internals. This is entirely optional. If you don't want or can't risk item retrieval, once the mechs are gone, it's pretty easy to just pick apart the base however you want. And now we get to do it again, but for honor. And this time we get to do it with other people's people. This modifier doesn't happen terribly often, but every once in a while you'll get a quest like this where as part of accepting it, you'll be given a fighting force of expendable troops to help with the attack. The term help is very loose here, and more often than not, keeping these people around is more trouble than it's worth, but Empire soldiers tend to at least have vaguely useful things like armor and weapons. The mechs box themselves into a corner here, and occluded a bunch of their own sightlines, and there aren't any reinforcements to worry about with this one, so general strategy here is pretty simple. It's picking off the few easy turrets, and then an uncoordinated Zerg rush. Yeah, when I said those combatants were expendable, I meant it. The quest system is the food service industry of Rimworld, and they are patronizing your establishment. You can get their order wrong, spit in their food, cuss them out to their face, set them all on fire, and experience 100% mortality rates, and the quest giver will still thank you for your excellent service and tip promptly. Once I have all the mechs and turrets nice and distracted with the conveniently less than squishy meat blobs, I bring in my ranged pawns to help focus fire down the big targets and EMP anything that looks like it might be able to do some damage, but that's really about it. Now that I have a decent nobility candidate in Brendan, the honor for this engagement is going to go to him instead of 806, which, if anything, is a compliment to 806, because my reasoning here is the dude is so jacked that I'd rather have him shooting things instead of wasting his time casting psychic powers. Quite a lot of time passes without anything terribly interesting happening other than a string of plain old boring vanilla raids that got so effectively wiped up that they might as well have been cosplaying as a sham WoW commercial, and a massive swath of expansion. We have crafting and storage areas now, and with advanced fabrication research completed, we are well on our way to a healthy mid-game expansion arc. My earlier concerns with the food situation also proved themselves to be unfounded, thanks to an entirely accidental quirk of how animals work. Animal spawning is biome dependent, and as far as I can tell, that is the only factor that affects how quickly they wander in from the map edge. Boreal forests, as the name suggests, are supposed to be both boreal and forested, and as such have quite a high spawn rate. This has some interesting ramifications when the whole area is 20 degrees colder than normal, because frozen map equals no plants, and no plants equals animals looking for novel food sources. But boreal forest also equals lots of animals. This ensures that every herbivorous animal that spawns in, which is a lot, inevitably forms a giant conga line towards my open kitchen, which is the only source of edible food on the map, and this has predictable consequences. It's gotten so ridiculous that Brendan is now a level 6 melee combatant, entirely due to the sheer unrelenting intensity with which I have him assaulting woodland creatures, and the resulting meat output from his beating sessions have been feeding my entire colony, in addition to the losses that come from hosting an all-you-can-eat buffet for the local furry convention. Speaking of which, one of the quests you can get is to fight off a horde of scaria-ridden animals. Unless you have a very good reason not to do this, you should always take this quest. The quest specifically states that you have to kill the animals, but you can safely ignore all of that nonsense because the stated win condition for this kind of quest is wrong. Or at least misleading, because it doesn't trigger when the animals are killed, it triggers when they aren't present on the map anymore, which can also be accomplished by hiding behind a 1-block thick wall and ignoring them for a couple of days. With the click of a button, you too can enjoy the incredible wealth and opportunities presented by owning doors and using them. Truly, the rich just get richer. Or, alternatively, you can be me, and luck into getting a ridiculous number of massively stacked range units as your expendable fighting force, and frog march them across the landscape, Ramboing megaslaws as they go. I have not the faintest inkling of what is wrong with the Fallen Empire, but I am convinced that they're sending me political dissidents and hoping they have an accident or something, because there is zero excuse for not being able to handle 23 megaslaws with the force they gave me. Seriously, my only command was literally, stand in a swamp and shoot them until you die. We suffered 20% attrition, entirely due not to injury or death, but instead to snack breaks, and the only reason that one maneuver didn't win then and there was because some of the slaws got lost and I had to go hunt them down. The sapper bait failed utterly, by the way. I don't know if it's my turret coverage being too weak or the pathing being too aggressive or what, but this group of mechs said nuts to that and went through the front door. Wasn't really an issue, since I didn't get any centipedes in the raid and was able to flank and chain stun them into oblivion, but clearly more fortification is necessary. No skin off my back, the great American pastime might be baseball, or possibly road construction, depending on who you talk to, but the great goose pastime is building obscenely over-engineered fortifications. After all, why worry about sappers when your entire base is equipped to fight off a sapper raid at any point in any location, right? Pirate raids have been generous and netted me quite a stack of assault rifles, so I opt to not immediately rush for charge rifles in favor of getting some bionics going for the, everyone who needs them. I don't think I've ever had a colony who has been as prone to losing bits of themselves as this one. It's ridiculous. If you added up all the parts that need replacement, we would be down an entire pawn. Royalty adds a bunch of options for cosmetic and performance-enhancing surgery that I'll be taking advantage of later on, but crafting those requires research I can't unlock until I buy something called a tech print from a trader, and this run has been weirdly cash-strapped so far. I'll be looking to change that here in a bit. Meanwhile, the incessant demands of the Fallen Empire for me to clip their hangnails and kiss their boo-boos better hasn't let up in the slightest, and I, for one, am entirely okay with that. I have two missions here that I'll be accepting, one to send a pawn off for a bit to go punch potatoes, and another to do a bit of light mercenary work. I opted to send Paxer Prime as my prime potato puncher pawn, not out of spite, but because of my pawns he is the most specialized and I can afford to not have him doing some mining for a bit. The fact that his plant skill is currently 2 is apparently entirely irrelevant to the mission, which is to go do a bunch of farming, though given that the mission's coming from the Fallen Empire, perhaps that's seen as an unusually high skill differential. For everyone else, I load up to go stomp some pirates. I can't be bothered to walk places myself like a heathen, but the Fallen Empire has generously offered to provide space limo transport to and from the combat site, so the only thing I have to worry about is surviving the fight. One of the goals of my first series was world domination, and in accomplishing that I got pretty dang good at organizing raids against enemy settlements, but even without that practice, I'm pretty sure this raid would have gone just fine. 4 dudes and a turret is not a terribly good matchup against 8 dudes in mid-game gear, and they made it worse for themselves by letting me walk up right next to them before engaging. The one drawback of relying on Empire transportation is that you can't as easily loot the place to the ground as you could if you brought your own ride. You used to be able to load up the shuttle with whatever you wanted after the raid was done, kind of like a giant drop pod, but it worked with a caravan functionality that lets you pick up anything on the map instantly when you reformed on the map tile instead of a traditional you gotta haul it yourself style drop pod. This was fantastic, because the shuttles had 2,000 kilos of capacity, which is an enormous amount of storage space, and it let you do things like deforest the entire map and bring it back with you. This was apparently deemed too overpowered somewhere down the line, and the gods of TSA have mandated that colonists can no longer do this on Empire Air due to the phenomenal jet fuel requirements of letting people bring along 1,600 kilos of raw granite in their checked bags. Of course, there is a way around this, which is smuggling everything we want back to our base by having our pawns carry it on their persons. Somehow. Word of the wise here, don't ask Saya how she managed to fit an entire automated gunnery emplacement on her person and take it through airport security when her carry-on bag was full of lamps. Just thank her for her service and move on. So anyway, we are blazing through research projects now, and with the rest of my colony in something of a holding pattern, it's time to expand our industrial base. Case in point, I've been making noise about wanting to get indoor plant grows working for ages now, but never got around to actually doing it, so one of those seems like an excellent next step. Food is largely self-supplying anytime the temperature drops below freezing, which is most of the year, but cloth, herbal medicine, and recreational pharmaceuticals all have various useful applications, and I'm running problematically low on the first two. As we move forward, the how do I make green things problem is going to solve itself quite handily, but I will have to save that little nugget of nonsense for the next episode. For now, thank you all for your time, and I hope you enjoyed.